Okay, hello and welcome to our graduate school series. Today we will be talking about PhDs and how to get one, how to apply. So without further ado, I will have our panelists introduce themselves. Brad, why don't you start us off?
Sure. Hi, thanks for putting this together, Leah. My name is Brad Harris. I attended Duke University to get an undergraduate degree, double majored in history and English, but I had a lot of overlap with chemistry and economics. And I did a thesis as a senior looking at the history of chemical engineering. And so I ended up deciding to apply to an interdisciplinary program for grad school. I ended up going to Stanford and got a PhD in the history of science and technology.
Excellent, thank you. Benny?
Hello, my name is Benny DeMaio. I am a graduate student at Princeton in the first year studying developmental psychology. I did my undergrad at Stanford, where I also studied psychology. And I was kind of initially interested in language development and how kids learn language, and that kind of morphed into my current interests. So here I study how children come to understand social concepts like race, gender, things like that. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Jackson.
Hi, so my name is Jackson McFarlane. I did my undergrad in New Zealand at the University of Auckland in geophysics and applied math, and I got into studying rocks and the properties of rocks and how they change over time. And I am now at Stanford finishing up my PhD. I'll be actually defending it next week. And I've been working here on the cementation of volcanic ash in geothermal settings and how we can monitor the changes in rocks from the surface. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. So let's jump right in. So Benny, I'm going to have you kick us off with the application process for applying for a PhD, because it's pretty different from when you apply for a graduate degree or certainly an undergrad degree.
Yeah, so I went through this process relatively recently because this is my first year of graduate school. So it is quite different from other graduate programs like other master's degrees or even other doctoral degrees. PhDs are, the emphasis of getting a PhD is in doing research, which means that the application process is also geared towards that. So that means that you're choosing a school that you're going to attend like you would with any other program, but even more than that, you're choosing an advisor or a set of faculty advisors that you're going to work with for a long time, 5 or 6 years, or even longer in some fields. So kind of in some ways, it's like choosing the school is secondary or on equal planes with choosing faculty members that you're going to work with. So the amount of specificity in what you want to do and kind of what you're interested in required to kind of find a good fit is very high. So the application process, you generally start by having some kind of research experience beforehand that kind of gets you interested in a particular topic, and that serves as a launch pad into kind of understanding who's out there, who's doing the kind of research that you might be interested in. Generally, I think it differs by field, but a lot of people contact potential advisors that they're interested in working with before they apply, ask them if they're taking students, because that's another dynamic that happens in PhD programs where the person you're interested in working with may not even be taking students that year. So some people reach out to advisors beforehand, ask if they're taking students, and if they are, then they proceed with the application to the university, which is routed through like a general system university. But importantly, the person reading your application are the folks that are planning on taking you as a student. So it's much more like applying to a job than it is applying to other kind of graduate programs where you're one of hundreds that's going to be accepted possibly. I don't know if there are more specifics, Leah, that you wanted me to go over than that.
No, that's great. Jackson, maybe talk a little bit about your process, similarities, differences, experiences.
Yeah, my process was very, very similar in that I had done a little bit of undergraduate research. I really enjoyed what I was doing and wanted to do more. And so as my advisors then helped me find people and I'm a dual US citizen, so I was interested in coming to the States, and potential advisors here in the US that did similar research or research that I might be interested in, and reaching out to them. And I think that was a real difference between applying to a graduate, PhD program versus any other type of program, is you're not trying to show in your application how smart you are or how qualified you are. It's really showing how interested you are in that topic or working with that person. And that's really important from the faculty side, because you're signing up for 5, 6, 7 years of research. And so they want to know you're really motivated and interested in doing this, so that you're more likely to see it all the way through. You're not going to get halfway through and just kind of lose interest because you were doing a PhD because you didn't know what else to do. So really showing that you are interested in that, you're motivated to work with those people. But otherwise, I think my process was very similar, and it goes with judging the fit with the faculty, in both your personality but also working style. And so a lot of it is talking to graduate students that may already be working with that professor or even have graduated recently, and understanding their working style, whether they meet with their students weekly, whether they meet with their students monthly, and making sure that's going to fit with the way you like to work, because that if there's conflicts in working, then that relationship can fall apart very quickly, which makes your life not very fun.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Benny, I'm going to pick on you again because you're so fresh in this process, but what was the hardest part for you about doing this application process?
Yeah, I mean, the hardest part is, I would say there are kind of two equally hard parts. One of them is just identifying what it is and who it is you want to work with, like what it is you want to work on and who is doing a thing that's going to kind of really fit your needs. Because, in my field, psychology, there's a million faculty members out there and you have to choose somehow. And really, without guidance from mentors that I had in undergrad, I don't think I would have done a very good job of choosing. So that is tricky, to kind of whittle down the choices that you have, so that you're not applying to a million programs, you're applying to like targeted ones that are going to be really good for you. So that's one of the hardest things, I thought. And then another part that's tricky is there is a component of an application to a PhD program that, most programs have a form of this in one way or another, which is where you have to write basically a statement of purpose for describing why you want to go to graduate school. And that's like at most 2 pages describing basically what you've done before in research, why you're interested, why you want to do a PhD. And those kinds of statements are quite challenging to write, because you have to pack a lot into those 2 pages, and be super concise and clear and also engaging and all this stuff. And it's not a kind of a creative type of essay that you might write for kind of admission into an undergraduate program where you get to like really show your personality through this. I mean, you can in certain ways, but much less so. It's kind of a much more straightforward document that really has to hit a lot of certain points. It's, I think people's kind of success or lack of success in the application process in graduate school really can hinge on these kinds of statements. And like Jackson was saying, it's not as much about a CV or like your grades or your transcript or anything like that. It's like in a few paragraphs, can you grab the attention of a potential faculty member? And that takes a lot of thought and a lot of drafts. And I spent, months with my mentors thinking about how to write these things. So yeah, I would say that is a challenging part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jackson, I know that you mentioned that you are a dual citizen, but there were some differences in applying to an American school, namely the GRE. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and I first off want to say, applying as a graduate student or an international student, the group that I came into my department with were about 50-50 international and domestic. So from the university's point of view, they really don't care. They are very well versed at handling applications from international students, converting GPAs to whatever you use in your country versus the US is seamless. And so it was much more just some logistical things on my side that were tricky. So one of them was taking the GRE test, which is something you probably want to look up, whether they're still using this for certain departments with changes in COVID, and also it seems to be getting phased out to some extent, but I'd never really taken a standardized test before. We don't have the SATs and the ACTs to get into college. And so even though I knew the type of material being tested, I just had to practice taking that style of test and doing a bunch of practice GREs just so I could feel comfortable doing that. And then with the application process, once you've applied, often what schools will do is they will invite a small group of candidates who are being considered to come to visit the school. And that is both for you to get a feeling of the school and whether you want to go, but also for the advisors to get more of a one-on-one interaction with you. And if you're in the US often, and this very much changes depending on the schools, but a lot of them will pay for your travel if you're within the US. But if you're internationally, they'll only fund a certain amount. And so it just wasn't feasible to be flying back and forth to the US for these 2-3 day visits. And so how I got around that was I found a conference in the US which had funding for undergraduate students, and I got funding to come to a conference. And then from there, I was able to connect with a lot of the faculty I was interested in and meet with them. And then I didn't go to I was still invited to the visits and I chose not to go, which felt like a real risk at the time. But the faculty didn't care. They were very understanding, and I was still accepted to those schools. So it clearly wasn't a deal breaker. And then obviously in the coming admission cycles, especially in the next one, it's likely that these visits will be virtual anyway. And then the very last thing was that with funding, a lot of the schools I applied to then had information about what funding was available, and the cost of living changes a lot. So one of the places I was accepted to was the Colorado School of Mines in Golden, Colorado, which is quite a small town. And then also obviously I was accepted to Stanford, which is in the heart of Silicon Valley. And the amount of stipend I was offered was triple for Stanford, but the cost of rent in the Bay Area is at least triple what it is in Golden. And so trying to judge from a foreign country, this cost of living was quite tricky. So I had to do a little bit of research to understand how these offers sort of compared.
That's great. And that actually brings me into my next question, which is talking about financing your education, because that's also pretty different when it comes to a PhD. So Brad, if you could tell us a little bit about that, what your process was, what that looks like, maybe just some general information would be great as well.
Sure. Yeah, so my experience was that most PhD programs I was applying to in the history of science or in history, and I believe that this is true across most PhD programs, full PhD programs generally do offer kind of an automatic funding, fellowship stipend package, so that you're not taking out loans, you're not self-financing. It's different with master's programs. But with PhD programs, generally speaking, most of the programs you'll apply to will offer funding to go with your offer. And so for me, the most important part of that was looking at, to the point that was raised earlier, how far did that funding go in the local environment, in the local community, in terms of housing and, travel expenses to and from, the particular graduate school home or what have you, but also the length of that funding. So there were several programs I applied to that, the average program was going to last between 5 and 7 years. And the funding might only last for 5 or for 4. And so, you have the funding, but it's really all up front, making sure it's going to last you the full duration of your PhD. And in my case, I ended up finishing in 7 years, which is average really in my field. I had to learn how to research in multiple different languages. So I chose Stanford because it looked like it would be easy or relatively easy for me to secure that additional 6th and even 7th year of funding. Whereas there were other programs I looked at and I had some offers to, and funding did come into play. It looked like it was going to be a little more difficult for me to guarantee that 6th or 7th year of funding if I needed it. So that's probably the most important thing to pay attention to when it comes to funding.
Great, thank you so much. Does definitely a lot of factors to consider. So we have a question from one of our attendees, which is a great question. So talking about applying to programs in Europe, and or applying to programs if you've already completed a master's degree. So Jackson, if you could just speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And so that goes to some slight differences in the way the PhD programs are done here in the US versus the European style. And so in the US, generally students often come straight from doing their undergrad, or they might have take some time off to work. And then it's somewhere from a 5 to 7 year process where the first couple of years are similar to a master's program. So you're still going to take some classes, you do some initial research, and then there's a transition where you go from kind of a master's style student to a PhD style student. I think that's fairly common across other disciplines, but that was my experience in the US. Whereas the European version, which is also what they have in New Zealand, is that you do undergrad, master's, PhD. And so if you are an undergrad looking to apply for a PhD, you really need to, in Europe, you need to do a master's first, and you might be able to do that at that institution. And then, whereas in the US, you would do it all at one. And if you're in the other camp where you've already done a master's and you're now applying to a PhD in the US, you can often credit some of those classes. So those first couple of years, you can get through that a little bit quicker, and you'll end up doing your PhD a little bit faster. So it's sort of, in the end, all comes out in the wash. But there's just whether the master's and PhD are inbuilt in the US versus two separate things in the Europe, sorry.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so last piece on applying. Benny, very quickly, what piece of advice would you give to someone applying now? Because you kind of went through during COVID, and it's kind of a crazy process right now. So also because you just did it, I'm picking on you.
No, yeah, it's great. What advice would I have? I would say to do as much research as you can, both in terms academically and not academically, about who you're planning to work with. Because that is sort of the make or break. You're in a program for a long time. You want to be sure that the people that you're applying to work with are people that are nice and that you're interested in.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so you've gotten into grad school, you've gotten into your PhD program, you're ready. Brad, tell me some of the fun parts about getting a PhD.
Well, it's one of the most, I think it's one of the only opportunities you have to just be funded to think and pursue your own intellectual interests for multiple years at a time. In my experience, there was quite a bit of built-in idle, I would say, I call it idle, but it's more self-directed time where you can decide, there's quite a bit of wiggle room in the curriculum. You can decide the classes you want to take. And you can decide what kind of independent studies and what sort of research you're going to do. Grad school at the PhD level is very long-term kind of intellectual project planning. So you'll have 2 years, for example, of funding to do a particular part of your research, let's say. And that just opens up incredible opportunities for you to network with lots of different people, to target different archives, to do research around the country or around the world that could incorporate just personal, interests. What places do you want to travel to? What people do you want to talk to? So that's my fondest memory, is sort of looking back nostalgically now and just having so much self-directed time. It can cut both ways. There were certainly a lot of my peers who, and I, at times I did too, feel anxious that I actually felt idle. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And it was maybe hard to get that time to be, sustainably structured. But, if you can keep it structured and you can keep focused it's very liberating intellectually, and it can help you kind of discover questions and conversations you may never have been able to in a more directed environment.
Great. Jackson, same question. Something that was really fun about your program.
Yeah, I definitely feel the same way that Brad did about the hub of people with the same interests and the same sort of topics that you're interested in, being able to have these conversations, but also having the hub of research facilities is very rare for universities or colleges. And so, at Stanford, they have amazing facilities for experimental work, which is what I do. And I can look, be reading about a technique that can be applied and think, oh, I could totally use that in my work. And then I just look up where that machine is and I can go and get trained on it and use it. And that's super rare. It's something that you don't find in a lot of other places. And being able to do that hands-on and really learn how to use these different techniques, you learn the limitations of them. And so that's been really, really great. And I think it's a PhD is 5 to 7 years of your life. And so your life goes on during that time. I got married during my PhD. I had a kid during my PhD. And so I have all these fond memories of my life through my PhD where I had more, like Brad talked about, more freedom to enjoy my life, but also to explore curiosities of science. And altogether, it's a pretty cool journey.
And I'm going to pick on you to maybe as an anecdote, your Roman concrete that you got to study, which is a pretty cool thing that you got to access. So maybe like a quick thing on that.
Yeah, so I, which was one of the selling points of coming to Stanford, was I got to work on 2,000-year-old cores of Roman concrete, which was something I never thought I'd do when I was studying rocks as an undergrad, and then the opportunity to sort of apply my work to a historical material and bring these fields together was really cool. Pretty scary when I got to the point where I had to break it to test how strong it was, and the sample was 2,000 years old, and once it was done, it was done. But yeah, the opportunities that even when you start, it's the other thing about a PhD is you have no idea where your PhD is going to take you. You come in with some idea of what your research is going to be, and then as you get along, you might realize that actually that's impossible, or you find this other question that's more interesting, and you go on this journey and you end up learning about so many things you never thought you'd learn about. And then the PhD that you have at the end is either totally different or slightly different. But yeah, you get to, just as Brad was saying, think, come up with questions, and then explore them.
So cool. Okay, so on the other side of that, Benny, maybe some challenges that you've encountered so far, maybe COVID aside, well, or maybe including COVID.
Yeah, well, I mean, this has been a very strange year to begin graduate school, no question. Doing all my classes online, all my research is online. It's definitely odd. And I think this is not unique to doing a PhD. It's been a little bit isolating to kind of be in your room doing all this stuff. But I think I kind of separate from that, I think going to something that Brad was saying about trying to figure out what it is that you're doing. That's a challenge because there's a lot of space you can explore. And it does end up shifting, like Jackson was saying, as you go on. But you have to start somewhere. Like you have to start with some question that you're going to kind of make a concrete plan to address. And something that I've needed help with from my advisors is going from the kind of big space of being interested in something broadly to kind of, okay, like how do we put this into an experiment? How do we test it? How do we study this exact thing and get some kind of deliverable result? So that's been a challenge for me, and it's been really great to have mentors that have kind of helped me in that way, and who kind of recognize that I may be less experienced in that and push me towards that. And it's also, I think part of any new experience, I'm from Los Angeles. I moved across the country to New Jersey to start graduate school. I didn't know anybody when I moved here. And that brings its own challenges, kind of starting a new life in a way, in a different place. It's really exciting, but it's also, it takes some work to kind of to gain your footing in a new place, new environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jackson, maybe a challenge that you have found as you're very close to the end of your PhD.
If I mute myself, I can tell you that, yeah, it's a long journey, and the very interesting thing is the relationship with your advisor, because in grad school, when you're in a PhD, you're in a kind of a unique position where you're investigating something that no one else knows. You're trying to find new research, and so your advisor doesn't know the answer. They're going to help you, and so in some ways you're sort of collaborators. You're working together to find these answers, but they're also kind of your boss in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of, the PhD program is set up in a very vague way in a lot of ways, because everyone's PhD is different. It has to be sort of loose definitions of when you're done or when you reach certain milestones. And so there can be a lot of stress there about whether you're on track, whether you're going to reach these milestones that are sort of vaguely set, and inevitably over a 5 to 7 year process, you're going to have lots of interactions with your advisor where you might disagree on things or tensions. And so that can be difficult to manage. And I think a lot of skills that I've developed over my PhD beyond the research is also about managing relationships and managing expectations and handling these sort of vague deadlines or vague expectations. And so those are skills that I've learned and that I can take away with me to other jobs. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but something that I had to learn to deal with over that time. And advisors are humans; they have strengths and weaknesses. And I think one of the things I found was that an area that I needed the most support with was not necessarily the area that my advisor was best equipped to support me in. And so I had to work around that. But and that can be something that when you're looking at grad schools trying to understand, and it's hard to predict where your weaknesses are going to be, but where your advisor, you're going to need the most support, and whether that's something that they can provide.
Awesome, thank you. And Brad, can you talk a little bit about balancing your PhD and applying for jobs? The PhD is so different. What did that look like for you, either during or after school?
Sure. My case might be a little bit hard to generalize, because as I was, getting toward the end, I was about 2 years away from graduating, from finishing. I was, well on my way to finishing my dissertation, and I was going on the academic job market, and I was starting to understand the options for postdocs and potentially even a couple of tenure track opportunities. But at the same time, because of that networking and that kind of cross-disciplinary exploration that I was talking about earlier, I managed to become close with some people in the business school at Stanford, and really was fascinated with what they were doing. And I ended up actually taking a job as the director of operations in a tech startup. So my last 2 years at Stanford, I was frantically finishing my dissertation on weekends and working at the tech startup all week down in the financial district of San Francisco, just because it just felt like an opportunity I couldn't pass up. And really, really great people, very intelligent, inspiring leaders that I wanted to learn from. This was just part of that intellectual curiosity. And so, for me, I think that was a little different than what a lot of my colleagues were doing. And I think, in fact, that there were a lot of people in my cohort that were sort of mystified that I was doing that. And they were a little shocked that I was not necessarily planning on pursuing an academic job, at least not in the near term. So that's what I did. I finished, I graduated, I got my dissertation all set, defended, and everything was great, and just kept on going with the tech startup for quite some time after that. And then since then, I've been able to leverage that, different experience into some other opportunities I can say more about. But I think that the moral of the story that might be generalizable is, to Jackson's point earlier, these are very cosmopolitan, dynamic institutions for the most part, where you're going to be able to get a PhD. So there's so many of these kinds of opportunities. It's very difficult to predict. It just sort of depends on your initiative and your interest.
Great, thank you. And that is a great segue into our third and final section, which is talking about after school. So after you have defended, what are your classmates doing? Jackson, you're at the end. What are you looking to do? What are some of your classmates doing?
Yeah, so I think, and maybe this experience or view is maybe typical of a lot of the sciences and maybe engineering, not for everything, but there's sort of three main avenues where people obviously want to stay in academia. They want to go on to become a professor, and so they're looking for postdoc opportunities at other universities where they can continue their research and build a resume to then apply for a faculty position eventually. There's sort of the opposite direction where people don't want to be in academia, and maybe they never intended on staying in academia. They did quite an applied PhD to go and then get a job in the public sector. And then there's also some in between things. One of those are national labs, where you don't have quite as much academic freedom as a professor, but you still are doing some of your own research as well as applied research. And that's sort of the area that I have been looking to go into. Obviously, COVID has made applying for jobs for experimental research quite an interesting process right now. But I think as well, a lot of people come into a PhD with an idea of the job they may want to be in at the end, and that's going to change as you get to the end, depending on whether that job exists or whether you're still interested in doing that. And so a big thing you develop is transferable skills. So that can be your specific research skills you've developed, but also the personal skills that I mentioned, like dealing with personalities, dealing with and your time management skills. There's a lot of time where you're directing your own research. And so managing projects, managing your time, how you work most efficiently. And that can be transferred to a lot of, I guess, any type of job. And a lot of people, and this is a lot of advice that I give to people now doing PhDs, is learn some skills on the side. You've got a lot of time, and a lot of people maybe have a side hustle where they're doing some sort of work or job, so that then that's skills that they're developing. Or the classic one here at Stanford is to take classes in machine learning and take advantage of the computer science that is very big at the moment. A lot of the buzzwords you see on job applications, and so you can develop those skills on the side and use that to really set yourself apart and open yourself up to more opportunities when you end.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brad, maybe talk a little bit about, you worked at a tech startup, but were there other avenues that some classmates maybe went down that you can talk about?
Sure. Well, of course, as Jackson mentioned, there's the academic job route. And that's terrain that's changing all the time. I think it's more comparable across the sciences and the humanities now than it used to be, which is to say many of my colleagues, and I think especially is increasingly the case today, will go on and do a postdoc after they finish their PhD. That can last a year, maybe up to 3 years. And that's often a funded stretch of time to help you refine your dissertation, prepare it for professional publication by a university press. So that'll be your first book. And that's a very big milestone for an aspiring professor. That is absolutely one of the highlights of, your ability to secure a tenure track job someplace or to get tenure at an institution is that first published book. Other people are fortunate to find a tenure track position right after finishing their PhD. For me, I think that because I tried to go a little bit outside of academia for a while, I did try to leverage those skills in different functions, and they've been very valuable ever since. I continue to consult in tobacco litigation, which had a lot of overlap with my research. So there's always litigation ongoing to try to help ameliorate some of the damage done by cigarettes over the last several decades. And several law firms have used some of my research and continue to consult with me. And so that's been wonderful. And then, of course, working at ESM, I spent 23 or 4 years in school, all in. I think it was like the 24th grade, if that's how you want to put it, by the time I finished. So it's a good perspective to help other people when they're just starting that that journey into college. That's been very rewarding for me. So yeah.
That's great. And thank you, Benny, for bringing this up. We're having a Slack channel, but we're sort of operating on the assumption that everybody knows exactly what a dissertation is. So Benny, maybe you could just tell us about what that really is. I mean, that's like the big project, and we keep saying it, but it would be good for you to explain that. We should have done this earlier, and I apologize.
No, yeah, it's okay. I realized like, the dissertation is not something that is super common in other kinds of schooling. Yeah, a dissertation is it's a kind of a body of research that you put together, that you've conducted, that serves to kind of show your work as a PhD student. And so that's kind of like the final product at the end. So when Brad and Jackson are talking about writing their dissertations, it's kind of like a culmination of the work that they've done throughout the 5, 6, 7 years of PhD. And different programs have different expectations of what the dissertation is going to be like. So for example, in some fields, it's, a few papers, you do a few research projects, you write papers on those research projects, you string them together, that's the dissertation. Some fields, it's like you really have to write basically a book about what you've done in graduate school. Like in the humanities field, people end up writing hundreds of pages, long books that are, can be published later on. But basically it's a culmination of what you've done in graduate school that shows what you've spent your time doing and is some new contribution to whatever field you're in. And when people talk about defending their dissertation, because that's come up a couple of times, basically what that means is to get the degree at the end, to get the title of PhD, you basically need to kind of stand before a committee of professors at the university who will basically kind of test you on your own work and ask you about stuff that you did and kind of basically ask you some pretty detailed questions on it, and then they evaluate your written dissertation. They decide that you passed, you get the degree at the end. And that is, I'm obviously nowhere close to that because I'm in my first year, and that doesn't start becoming a thing until later on, but it's a really kind of effortful part of the degree, is putting together the dissertation and then defending it.
Yeah, and maybe just quickly, so the dissertation is not something that you go into school having already. It's something that you develop with your advisors. Is that correct? It's
That's
something
right.
that you work on, and then it's, I'm sure it varies by program, but you would develop that with your advisors, right?
Yeah, like, I mean, the others should jump in if they want to correct or kind of, qualify what I'm saying at all. But yeah, basically it's like year 3 of the PhD or something, you put together a committee of faculty advisors who will kind of meet with you regularly to make sure that your dissertation is taking shape. But it's not something that you like enter the graduate program like knowing, oh, I'm going to write it on this. And it's certainly not something that you have written before you start graduate school. It's something that you start later on once you've already started doing different projects that will become part of the dissertation.
Perfect, thank you. That might seem like a very obvious thing, but here we are. Okay, so Brad, tell us how you use your PhD in everyday life. You touched on it a little bit with being able to consult with attorneys and things like that, but maybe like a little bit more.
Sure. So I do continue to write and publish professionally in history, and that's very satisfying to me. I continue, like you mentioned, I do continue to consult, mostly for different law firms, and on some research with my former advisor at Stanford. He and I remain very close. So sometimes he'll have me review, drafts of his work and that sort of thing, in addition to, the consulting. I would also say that, I find the time I invested in learning how to think about the past as a PhD in the history of science and lots of current, debates and conflicts between science and politics and public policy and popularization of science, sensationalization of science, and how we navigate very tough questions like global warming, vaccination, epidemiology, those sorts of things, how you message science. This is all to me still very relevant, and I find that I've been well served by my background to just feel like I have a handle on some of that in a way that's personally satisfying and helps me when I'm, especially when I'm working on my own professional writing these days and consulting. So.
Awesome, thank you. And Jackson, a little bit about how you use your PhD in your everyday life.
Yeah, I think I sort of mentioned this before, but I think one of the biggest things is what I learned about myself during this PhD, during this long journey of working a lot of the times independently and managing my own time and learning how I work most efficiently. And I think those are skills that you keep for the rest of your life, that are going to serve you no matter where you end up or what you do. And now at ESM teaching, it helps me to relate to other students who work differently, who are learning differently, to help explain science in different ways. And so I think that's a big one. And you never know when your PhD is going to become useful. There's a lot of people get a PhD because it's the obvious choice in their career path. If you want to be a professor, you've got to have a PhD. And a lot of the times it's about a personal achievement. I wanted to do something that was hard, that I didn't know if I could do a PhD, and I learned how to do it, and I've developed as a person. And then even if you go into a job that doesn't necessarily require that PhD, you've still got these skills that you've learned that you're going to keep for the rest of your life.
Thank you. So, some final words of wisdom from everyone. If there's any questions from attendees, please send them in. We'll be glad to answer them. But final words of wisdom, Benny.
Yeah, final words of wisdom. I don't know that I have that much wisdom to give on this. I'm super new. I'd love some wisdom. I would say, though, I think maybe a couple things that are important. One of them is it's hard to overstate how important your relationship with your advisor is. And so when you're choosing a program, choose very carefully in terms of who you're working with, because that person can really make or break your experience. And the second thing I think is, in terms of reasons for doing a PhD, I sort of see, there are a lot of reasons for doing a PhD, but the common thing that all of them have is that you're interested in kind of exploring some set of questions, or you're interested by the research itself. And I think that if your reason for doing a PhD isn't in some way related to that, that's not maybe the best reason. Like if you're doing it for prestige, or you're doing it because you're not sure kind of what to do, except that seems like the next step or something, those can be part of the reason, but it shouldn't be the only reason I would say to pursue it.
Thank you. Brad?
Yeah, I'd like to echo what Benny was saying there. I think the way I would put it is, if you can't help but think about the questions relevant to the field you're considering going into graduate school for, then maybe a PhD is for you. If you just compulsively explore that field and you're reading those journals or those books or what have you, that's the kind of fuel that will keep you going for years through the uncertainty. So I think that that's a really big piece, is to know that part of yourself. And if you don't have that just helpless curiosity, then a PhD is a very long and can be a very uncertain road. So just know that about yourself. I think that's my most important little bit.
Perfect. And Jackson, any last pieces to share with our audience here?
I think I'd really echo what Benny said about making sure that you, the relationship with the advisor and learning about the people you're going to work with, because it's a very long journey. But I would also say learning about how universities and colleges work. And I think that's something in undergrad I didn't really understand, but and then I spent a lot of time talking with my undergraduate advisors about going to grad school and about the dynamics. And something that I didn't know at the time, but I've really seen now is a big factor that can affect your experience is the career stage of your advisor. When advisors first get hired or professors first get hired, they're often flush with cash. They get an injection of cash from the university to get started, and they don't have a lot of other committees that they're on or other commitments. And so you're likely to get a really one-on-one experience, have a lot of opportunities, but you're going to be very isolated. You're not going to have as many people in your group to work with, whereas advisors that are further on in their career likely have a lot more commitments that they need to do. You're going to spend less time working one-on-one with them, but they tend to have funnels of a huge line of graduate students that have gone before you. And so there's a lot more of a pathway for you to follow and a network that you can rely upon. So even if you're not talking to your advisor, there are other people that you can talk to and work with to answer questions or figure out what the next stage is. And so there's a lot of pros and cons, and that might depend on your strengths and where you think you might need it. And so understanding what life is like for a grad student, and that's something that during the visits, when you're talking with your professor, of course, it's a potential advisor, it's an interview, but when you talk to other grad students, they have very little say in whether you're going to get accepted or not. So it's a really opportunity to interview them and understand the dynamics of the group, the dynamics of the advisor, and whether you are going to fit in and they're going to be able to support you in the way you need to be supported, because that's going to dictate how much fun you have or how much you end up struggling. And then I'd throw one more thing out there for the international students is that if you're coming to the US, you're likely going to end up on either a F1 or a J1 visa, and the universities are well versed at handling these. Getting the visas are fairly straightforward. One limitation of the visas is that you can't work outside of the university. So in that case, the stipend becomes very important, because you can't have a side hustle, you can't work other jobs. You really need to survive on that stipend, which can be a struggle for some international students. The one exception to that is that you often can still do summer internships. And so I know that a lot of grad students, international grad students who would do summer internships every year to earn a bit of cash to then maintain their lifestyle through the year. The stipend is usually enough to live on, but if you have expensive hobbies or you like to do a lot of travel, then looking at whether your summer internships or how you can do that on your stipend is just a one difference that's probably the biggest one for international students.
That's super helpful. So thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I did not see any questions come through. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees. If you're watching a recording of this later, please feel free to reach out to us. You can reach me directly at clientservices@esmprep.com. Would be happy to answer your questions, connect you with Brad, Benny, and Jackson if you would like. If anything comes up, please let us know. Thank you again, and have a great rest of the day.